Before this video begins, I would like to take a quick moment to thank Bain Books for helping set up the interview that is in this video, and I would also like to apologize for the audio quality. When I was working in editing this video, I ran into some problems and I was not able to get the best audio quality. So you can still hear the interview, but it's just, you might have to turn up your volume a lot. I apologize for that. This was in no way the fault of the author or the publisher that helped set this up. This was my problem in editing, but I still hope that you enjoy the video. Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have the wonderful privilege of being joined by S M Stirling, a tremendous fantasy and science fiction author who has worked with numerous publishers. Today we are in the Bain suite over at Dragon Con. I want to thank Bain for setting this interview up. But Mr. Stirling, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.
So the first question I have is, how did you get into writing, and eventually how did you get into publishing?
Okay. Two separate questions. Writing is a bit of an obsession for most people who do it. They start early. Every writer I've ever talked to has had long, colorful, intricately scripted daydreams from a very young age. I certainly did. And I started telling stories when I was about 5 or 6. And I wrote my first novel in high school. It was the only literary course that's ever done anything for my writing career. The teacher said, "You're each going to write a novel this year." And
in high school?
In high school, yeah. It was a boarding school in Canada.
Oh.
And we did. There were 4 of us. We met once a week to talk it over, read each other's stuff. The teacher was available if you had questions, and I wrote a novel. About 70,000 words, and it was terrible. God, awful. It's sort of Tolkien, Robert E. Howard pastiche. But I learned a good deal doing it. Writing is one of those things you have to actually do to learn anything. And you have to be able to hear your own writing as if you were coming to it new.
Right.
Or some approximation thereof. I've met people who have talent and write and finish things, which is an important bit, but they can't hear their own prose. They keep seeing the ideal version in their head rather than what's actually on the page. That is a tragedy because they can't improve. But then I went to university and I was noodling around with some stories at the time. I did a dual history-English major. The English part was interesting, and then I got to read some fairly obscure older books. The history part was really interesting, and for a while I wanted to be a history professor, but then I looked into that. My God, talk about the tortures of Tantalus. And then my mother persuaded me to go to law school, which, apart from providing me with some colorful anecdotes about dishonest lawyers, was totally useless. And then I decided I was going to do something, like sober and realistic instead of law. I was going to write. And I spent 5 or 6 years working at odd jobs. I was a bouncer for 2 nights.
Really?
Yeah, it wasn't the violence that put me off, it was getting puked on. Which happened twice each night. That denim jacket was never the same. And I picked tobacco for a summer once. That I would not like to repeat. So I worked at odd jobs and sold my first story for 1/4 cent a word, and the magazine folded before they published it. It was published 27 years later. And then in '84, I sold my first novel, Snow Brother. I started it in law school, which is why it's full of hatred and violence. And I sold it to, oh God, she's still in the business and I can't remember her name. And she bought it for Signet and asked me to do some modifications. It was a sort of post-apocalyptic quasi-fantasy, so she said she wanted to make it heroic fantasy, so I put in an evil shaman and added 10,000 words. And that was no problem, and it was published. Did moderately, reasonably well, and I was expecting to do more, and I had a couple of projects in work, and then the editor skipped. This is called the business being orphaned, and it's not a good thing.
Yeah.
And the new editor after he finally got in contact with me, said, "We've acquired some Arthur C. Clarke reprint rights, so call me again next year," which was a bit daunting. Then I managed to sell some stuff to Bain, Jim Bain, then. And I went full-time in '88, which was the same year I got married. And I lived in early artistic poverty for quite some time. Then I wrote Island in the Sea of Time, originally for Bain. Jim Bain didn't like it. Jim Bain was an extremely intelligent guy, but he had his crotchets. And if you activated one of his crotchets, all hell broke loose, and I did with that one. So I pulled the book. He eventually said he'd publish it, but I knew he'd drop it into a black hole. So I pulled the book. My friend Harry Turtledove advised me to get an agent, and he recommended me to his agent, Russ Galen, who was a god among agents. And Russ had 2 publishers bidding for the book within 2 weeks. It makes a big difference to have a good agent. A bad agent will ruin you, and you can't tell in advance. And Tor wanted to buy it, and Penguin, at least one of the earlier incarnations of Penguin. So Tor was going to do it as an original hardcover, and Penguin was going to do it as a original softcover. Hardcovers are more prestigious, but Russ told me if you do it in Tor, they'll drop it into the it'll be lost in the medley. If you do it with Penguin, Lorraine Gilman, who was my editor there, then she's a writer too. He said she's young, she's hungry, she'll push it. And I went with Penguin and never looked back. The book's in its 38th printing, by the way. Jim said that it would, no one would want to read it, and I was right and he was wrong, and I get to sing the I Was Right song.
And what year was that published in?
That published in '98.
So did Jim ever acknowledge that he was wrong about it, or did it take a while for it to? No.
Yeah, Jim's intuition, as I said, was very sound. He really knew the publishing business and books, except, as I said, when you hit one of his buttons. But then most people are like that. Mm-hmm. We're not rational beings, we're rationalizing animals. Boy, confirmation bias and motivated reasoning rule all. I've read some studies on that, and the more intelligent you are and the more educated you are, the less objective you are, because you're more able to rationalize what you want to believe or do anyway.
So my next question is about your Emberverse series, also known as The Change. Mm-hmm. You wrote the first book, Dies the Fire, mm-hmm. which came out almost 20 years ago now. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that series and what it's been like to work on a series for that long?
Okay, that's 2005. It's actually linked to the Island in the Sea of Time trilogy. Island in the Sea of Time, Against the Tide of Years, and On the Oceans of Eternity. The Emberverse or Change series is what happens here when in Island in the Sea of Time, Nantucket is transferred back to the Bronze Age. What happens here is that there's a sudden, radical, local change in the laws of nature. The explosives don't work, electrical currents won't flow in metal wires, combustion engines don't work except Newcomen and steam engines, and they're virtually useless. And of course, civilization collapses. The first book, Dies the Fire, is sort of post-apocalyptic. Mm-hmm. Well, there's an apocalypse. It's definitely post-apocalyptic. And it follows a certain number of people, and their families are the ones who are at the center of the entire series, which is, I think, 15 books long. Yeah. Ended up with the Sky Blue Wolves, which is more or less 50 years later. And that was fun. I really enjoyed that. I like extrapolation and world building. I have to control my lust for description. Yeah. Although, in my latest book, I found that I didn't describe any meals in the first draft because I'm on a dulaglutide that affects your appetite, and I don't think about food anymore. So I had to go back and put some descriptions of meals in because my fans expect it.
With that series, what was the publisher that you worked with on that series?
Penguin.
Penguin. did you find that they would try to get you to write books of a certain length, or were they more open to whatever your length was?
Well, Island in the Sea of Time was a bit iffy that way because it was nearly 200,000 words, which is long.
Yeah.
They were thinking of splitting it up, but eventually decided not to. Just little tiny print. The ones I never had any length problems with the ones from Dies the Fire On. Now they were generally 120 to 170,000 words, and although when Russ Galen, my agent, called me back after I'd sent him the manuscript for Island in the Sea of Time, I said, "Did you like it?" And he said, "There's only two ways, Steve, to get me to read 1,000 pages of manuscript in a weekend. One is I like it, and the second is you're standing next to me with a gun in my ear." So,
I'm assuming that you didn't do the second one.
no, I didn't.
But eventually it worked out, because that's been a very, very
Yeah.
long-running series.
Writing is a game where you need talent and you need persistence and you need luck.
Yeah.
Hitting the right editor on the right day with the right story for them is crucial. Getting to an editor, which has gotten increasingly difficult over the course of my career. I mean, you know, I can because I've got credibility, because I've got stuff out there as on the New York Times list 5 times. So I'm not George Martin, obviously, but I've made a solid success of it. But if you're trying to break in, my God, the hurdles.
Yeah.
And publishers get unbelievable amounts of stuff sent to them.
Yeah.
Now, most of it's crap. I had a friend who did first reading for a publisher, and she kept what she called a funny file. There was the 600-page epic about an undersized paper bag from Louisville, Kentucky. It had self-esteem problems because it was smaller than the other paper bags, so it went on a quest to find itself. Or the one about a guy whose family was shipwrecked on an island off the coast of Georgia, one of the Sea Islands, and he was raised by the family goat. Being raised by the family goat, it took its toll of him, I quote. But you know, you can eliminate that stuff and fairly easily, but even so, there are thousands of publishable novels that come into a publishing house every month. And they're only going to publish 30 or 40 in any particular genre.
Right.
These days, self-publishing and independent publishers are more significant.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually get a good start that way.
Yeah.
When I was first in the business back in the 80s, self-publishing, or vanity presses as they were called then, were the kiss of death.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't want to go anywhere near them if you ever wanted to be taken seriously. But these days, they're quite significant, and new publishers, and it's easier to start a publishing company these days because distribution is easier.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon, for example, just for starters. Ebooks are a lot cheaper to produce than physical books. And you can do print-on-demand stuff, which is, you know, you don't need the vast labor force and capital investment you did back in the 80s.
Right.
So it's still a chancy business, very chancy. And then you have to hit the audience right. Because a book can be good and, as far as you can tell, entertaining, and it can still just flop. Or it hits the right people at the right time, word of mouth spreads. These days, word of mouth spreads a lot faster, and it takes off. Who can tell?
That's one of the discussions in entertainment, where there's this idea that they say, well, whether it's with Hollywood or whether it's with authors, they say, well, if you guys would just write good books, people will watch them or read them or whatever. And that never hung true to me, because there's so many authors I know who wrote amazing books that just didn't catch on as well.
Well, they had a saying back in ancient Rome, de gustibus non est disputandum, which means there's no accounting for taste. Some things never change. Actually, I've been researching ancient Rome for the series I'm working on now, and it's uncanny, some of the things that Roman artists and poets and so forth, and there were novelists there too, although it wasn't a big genre, said about finding their audience and so forth. They still ring true.
So my next question is about upcoming works. So you mentioned working with Bain. Before the interview started, you said this is your first time in quite a long time returning to Bain. Can you tell us about that book?
Yeah. It's a time travel alternate history series. It involves 5 American academics going to Austria in 2032. And they think they're going there to talk about a machine that can reliably give an absolute calendar date for historical artifacts. And that would be a holy grail for archaeologists and very important for historians. So the physicist who invented it asked this guy at Harvard, a very, very new minted doctor of philosophy and classical history is the way Harvard puts it, and to bring 4 graduate students, and they'd investigate the thing. It actually turns out to be a time machine, although the Americans don't really believe it's a time machine. One of them says, "Where's the fake CGI upright circle of rippling mercury?" So they get dumped back into the year 165 in the same place near Vienna, and which was Vindobona, or Vindobonum, Municipium Vindobonum then, and hijinks ensue. Hijinks are used satirically. It's not a comic novel, and it's the first of a series, and the title is To Turn the Tide. Marcus Aurelius is a character.
Oh, okay.
That was fun. I got to read his meditations again, which all the American historians have read Marcus Aurelius' meditations. They all know Latin, and several of them know Greek, although they find out that they have to adjust to the locals think their accents are impenetrable. And one of them quotes some bits of the meditations to Marcus Aurelius, and this is before Marcus Aurelius wrote it. So he looks at him and says, "Tribune, you express my own thoughts, but I have not rendered them into so coherent and eloquent a form yet."
So all that thought and research, perhaps, into being a history professor is paying off in some way, just not in the way that you would have expected back in the day.
Yeah, exactly. I love doing historical research. I've got to keep it under control, or I'll do too much, put too much in the book, which I also try to keep under control. But it's just endlessly fascinating. It's the story of, history is the story of the human race, and it's one of the miracles of the American educational system that can make history dull. That's an accomplishment. It takes real work. It's just endlessly fascinating. And of course, the further you go back, the less we know.
Yeah.
Island in the Sea of Time was set in 1250 BC, and it involved trips to Britain. Of course, archaeology and history do progress. Like, we can now do ancient DNA research and trace ancient migrations. And if I was writing Island in the Sea of Time again, I'd have to put it back another 1,000 years. Because the migration I thought occurred, and the consensus was occurred in 1250 BC, actually occurred in 2500 BC. And that's more or less been conclusively shown by now. So I thought I was, insuring myself against being charged with bad history by putting it that far back. I thought they'll never discover the details of the stuff back then, and they did. Live and learn.
So your new book, comes out next year. What month does it come out?
August. Early August of 24.
And do you have any other conventions that you're going to go to, or is there a place online, like a website or a blog or social media that people can find you?
Yeah, my website is smstirling.com, all lowercase. And I put up sample chapters of books there. Okay. So the first 3 chapters of To Turn the Tide are up on my website, and I encourage you to go and read. I don't, some people are nervous about posting sample chapters. I don't think people are going to read 3 chapters, or for that matter, 10 chapters, and then not buy the book.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's something that another author I follow, Brandon Sanderson, he does the same thing, and it actually pumps up people and gets more.
Exactly, and it spreads word. People talk about it online. I'm maybe going to the Worldcon in China in Chengdu.
Really?
Yeah, they've invited me, and I've begun the process, but getting a Chinese visa is an elaborate process.
Yeah.
And chancy too. They ask you questions about your father's occupation.
That's a long time ago, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I had to do some research on that. And I usually go to my local con in Santa Fe, in New Mexico, which is where I live. I live in Santa Fe. The con is in Albuquerque. It's called BuboniCon. It's generally held about a week before DragonCon, and I always come to DragonCon. I used to go to World Fantasy every year. It's where I met my wife and where I proposed to my wife. She passed away in 21. But I don't anymore. And Worldcon has gotten a bit ossified for my taste. I don't like being the youngest person in the room at a convention. It's rather strange. But BuboniCon and DragonCon are the ones I regularly attend. Writers tend to be, I'll sometimes say, shy exhibitionists, and we're almost all archetypical nerds. A lot of us are on the spectrum. I am mildly. And a lot of us tend to be natural hermits. So conventions are useful for getting you out and meeting and talking to people.
Well, wonderful. Well,
And, do you know how many writers it takes to change a light bulb?
I don't know.
Forget about that. Let me tell you about my light bulb.
I should have seen where that was going. That was good. That was clever. I'm gonna use that again.
Go right ahead.
I'm gonna do the thing that writers do, where good writers borrow from other writers, great writers steal from them outright.
Yes,
So
that's very true. And we also, in particularly in the science fiction field, Tuckerize each other.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Like I've Tuckerized Harry Turtledove quite a few times, and he has too. One of his series, where the Civil War came out differently, its alternate history, has a Michael Pound, which Michael is my middle name and my last name is Stirling, as in the pound sterling. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing this interview with me. I really appreciate it.
I got an opportunity to talk about my own books. Let me tell you about my light bulb.
Well, you can find his books, whether they're for Baen or otherwise, online. You can also, and I've seen them in bookstores still, so that's good too. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.